Hey everybody, let's get started today with our lecture. And we're going to start with punishment. So last time we talked about reinforcers. And a reinforcer is anything that encourages or increases a behavior. And remember, there are two types of reinforcers. There's positive reinforcers, meaning we're adding something desirable, or there are negative reinforcers, which means we take away something we don't want, and because we like that, we'll do that thing more. Now, we have the same logic when it comes to punishers. So a punishment is an event that follows an action that is meant to decrease the behavior it follows. So it is decreasing, it is discouraging a behavior. So for example, if a child touches a hot stove, that probably is not good, and the child will probably not like that, or a mouse being shocked at an experiment. So we have the same kind of layout here of positive and negative. So a positive punishment, remember, positive means to add. We are administering an adversive stimulus. So if my dog barks, I will spray the dog, add water, right? Which will then hopefully discourage the dog from barking. Or if I give somebody a speeding ticket, I'm administering something bad that will hopefully discourage a behavior. That is positive punishment. The inverse of that is negative punishment, which means I'm taking something that somebody wants away to make them stop doing something. So for example, taking away a teen's driving privileges. So if I revoke those privileges, whatever they did to lose those privileges, hopefully they won't do again. Or revoking somebody's library card because they did not pay the fees associated. So we're removing something we want to get somebody to stop doing something. So that's negative punishment. Okay, so let's talk about something potentially controversial. And I'm sure a lot of us have different experiences around this particular situation. But a very common way of conceptualizing punishment and reward is in parenting. And so something we need to think about is corporal punishment, or hitting, or spanking, and what role that plays in psychology and what research has been done on spanking or swatting or hitting. And this is what the research says. So I know that people are going to have, again, very diverse opinions about their experiences with this behavior, but what I'm telling you is what psychological research says. So this is not my opinion. This is the opinion of objective psychological science. Okay? So, if you physically punish a child for doing something at home, research typically says that they will stop doing that at home. That behavior becomes suppressed, not forgotten. So, punishment teaches discrimination. Meaning, let's say you are a parent and your child curses at home, and so you hit your child for cursing. What that child learns is, my mom hits me when I curse, or my dad hits me when I curse. But mom and dad, or my parent, they're not around if I'm at school. They're not around if I'm in the car with friends. And so it encourages them to discriminate the behavior from different situations, not to stop the behavior. And through generalization, right, that's a concept we learned from classical conditioning, we don't only just end up fearing being hit, we end up fearing the person doing the hitting. So the intention is not, oh man, if I curse, then I'm going to really get it from, somebody. It's, my mom hits me when I curse, I am scared of her. So again, that's more, it generalizes to the wrong stimulus. We want the stimulus to be the behavior we don't want, not the person administering the punishment. And physical punishment typically increases aggression through modeling. And modeling is a type of cognitive learning we'll talk about later. But spanked children often display increased aggression later in life. In general, punishment should not be the primary mode of behavior modification. It is less effective with than reinforcement. So research says that punishment is not the best behavior modulator, that reinforcement is. So it's better to reinforce the correct behavior than to punish the bad behavior. We probably won't do this. Ignore this. If you want extra work to do, I can give you this worksheet, but we're not going to do this one, so don't worry about it. Okay. So, where do we see applications of conditioning happening in different places in the world? So, at school, we might see operant conditioning being applied through adaptive quizzing that gives you immediate feedback. So, for example, a Kahoot or a Quizlet, like Quizlet Live thing, is a great example of reinforcement or punishment. Well, not punishment per se, but at providing feedback that's meaningful, that's rewarding language learning and giving feedback when you're not getting the right answer. In sports, we can reinforce success by gradually making things harder. We also call that scaffolding, which we'll talk about in developmental psychology. Basically, anything where you have to master a skill, if you're able to make things gradually harder, you're going to find success more and more and more, and it makes it more enjoyable. If I were to take someone first learning how to play baseball and get a pro pitcher to pitch at them, they're probably going to be very discouraged because they can't do it. So the idea is to gradually get them to feel reward from what they're doing. Something interesting is that we can actually reward ourselves to the point that we develop superstitions when we play sports. If I tap the bat or the plate with my bat and I keep hitting it, it must be the fact that I'm tapping the plate with the bat. So it creates superstitious thinking. In the workplace, reinforcement's really huge. Rewards are most likely to increase productivity if the desired performance has been well defined, and reinforcement should be soon or immediately after completing tasks. At home, we talked about accidentally reinforcing behavior through shaping, so don't cave in to protests or tantrums because it teaches the child that when I throw those tantrums, intermittently, I will get what I want. So it creates that intermittent reinforcement schedule. Don't create a negative parent-child relationship with anger or violence. So that goes back to the hitting or spanking. And notice when children are doing something right. It's more effective. For personal self-improvement, give yourself a measurable way of achieving a goal, right? This year, I want to pass 5 of my 6 classes. Is a measurable goal. And then tell people, because that social accountability will help you stay on track. Monitor how often you engage in the behavior. Reward yourself when you do it well. So if the midterm grades come in and you've passed at least 5 of 6, reward yourself for that. And then little by little, reduce the rewards gradually so that it just becomes a habit. Okay, so let's talk about constraints. So classical conditioning, while it works in unconscious processes in your body, it's not limitless. So we do have biological predispositions that will stop something important from being conditioned out. So for example, we can't necessarily condition out feeling hungry and eating food, right? Because we literally need that to survive. So we truly can't condition that out. So not all associations are learned equally well. So in humans, we can develop what's called taste aversion, which means if you've eaten something and it makes you sick, you learn to associate a specific taste with the feeling of nausea or being really turned off by a particular food. But different species aren't all going to experience that the same. Depending on what your species needs to survive, you might not be able to develop taste aversion to one food or another food. It's going to be dependent on the biological makeup of that species' body. So those types of things really just depend. Some limits on operant conditioning, like we've said earlier, you can't override biological constraints, right? So if you want to not ever drink water, and then you try to reward yourself for like going a whole day without drinking water, that's only going to last so long. Your nature to not die is going to overtake your will there. So there are limits on that operant conditioning. All right, so what are some cognitive influences on conditioning? Remember, cognitive means thinking. So for the most part, classical conditioning is automatic, meaning it bypasses your thinking before the response happens. However, when you are able to conceptualize that an unconditioned stimulus is about to happen, and then you develop an understanding of what's happening to you, you might be able to weaken or eliminate conditioning happening. So, for example, if we try to make someone aversive to drinking alcohol, and in order to do that, we say we're going to give them an alcoholic beverage that has a nausea pill in it. So when they drink it, they immediately get very nauseated. If the person knows that the alcohol has the nausea pill in it, they will not develop the conditioned association because cognition will tell them, okay, but that wasn't the alcohol, it was the pill in it, right? So there's a limit based on what we know and think about if we're very cognitively paying close attention. So it's not this limitless, wonderful, perfect system of behavior modification. There are influences that can prevent it from happening. On operant conditioning, we can actually do what's called latent learning because of our cognition. So the first time we send a mouse or a rat through a maze, for example, they're going to bumble around, hit the walls, explore it, and they're going to create what's called a cognitive map. That means it's a mental representation of the environment. And then when they go through that maze later, they will take what they have learned from their first time through and do it faster because they've developed that cognitive map and they experience this latent or delayed learning. Oh yeah, I know how to do this. You actually will experience latent learning if you sightsee in a new town. You'll be walking through this brand new plaza and you're looking at this restaurant and that cafe and this museum and that and that and that. And then at some point, maybe a couple hours later, someone might ask you, hey, where's the museum? And without realizing it, you learned where that museum was and go, oh, it's across from the cafe, even if you didn't realize you knew it. So latent learning is learning that occurs but is not apparent until there's an incentive to display it. Again, that's like a delayed or latent learning process. So children might learn from watching a parent but don't display it until they need to. So let's say you're a toddler and you're watching your mom fold socks in the laundry. And then one day your mom goes, oh, do you want to help with laundry? Can you help fold socks? And even though your mom didn't teach you how to do it directly, because you observed, you can do it just because you modeled her. Okay? So that's latent learning. There's another interesting type of learning called insight learning. And this is learning that happens after there's almost no interaction with an environment. It's a sudden moment of aha. It's a sudden realization of a problem solution. And so there's a story that this construction company was building this brand new building, and they had a pipe that went into the ground. And when they looked in this pipe, they saw that there was a bird inside. And they were about to fill this pipe in and build around it. And they realized, well, we can't do that if there's a living thing in there. And so they tried all of these different ways to try and get the bird out, and none of them worked. And then this kid comes along, and he noticed what they were trying to do and had the sudden realization to slowly fill the pipe with sand. And as the sand filled in, the bird would step on top of it. And so the sand level comes up, the bird steps on top of it until the level reached the top and the bird could come out. And that sudden realization, that moment of insight, none of the other construction workers had, except for this person that comes by with no experience with this construction site. So that is insight learning. Another important cognitive impact on conditioning is intrinsic motivation. So it's really important that when you're trying to learn a new behavior or learn a new habit, that you have an internal reason for doing so, because you actually care about what you're doing. Let's say, for example, I ask for some class helpers to help me run psychology class. And let's say you have a deep interest in psychology, and so you volunteer out of the goodness of your heart and say, I love psychology, I want to be a classroom helper, and then you help. Great. You have an intrinsic reason to want to help. Now let's say I say, I need some class helpers for psychology. Everyone that helps me will get 5 extra credit points on every test. And so a bunch of people volunteer. And then midway through the semester, I say, hey, I'm no longer going to be giving 5 points to people that are classroom helpers. Suddenly, the motivation completely tanks because there was an external or extrinsic motivator there that destroyed the intrinsic part. And you go, well, if I have to be bribed into doing this, it must not be worth doing it. And so the motivation to do it tanks, and you might drop out of it. So it's important that when you are participating in something, you're trying to build a new skill, that you want to do it because it means a lot to you and that you actually care about what you're doing, so that the intrinsic motivation drives you and the extrinsic things aren't the only reason you're doing it. For example, reading. For a lot of kids, school assignments about books end up destroying their love of reading because it's all based on grades and things like that, and essays and doing well on tests. Those are extrinsic things. And so children lose the motivation to keep reading because there's no more rewards or punishments for doing it, and they've lost the intrinsic reason that they wanted to in the first place. Again, this is extrinsic motivation. It's a desire to perform a behavior or to receive promised rewards or to avoid a threatened punishment. It's important that extrinsic motivators are not the only reason, again, like I just said, that someone does something. They need to have an intrinsic understanding of why they're doing it. Oops, sorry, I'm trying to move my little face here. Okay, so coping. This is another interesting motivation-based concept. When we experience problems, we're trying to learn a new skill, we're trying to achieve something, we're often going to hit roadblocks. So for a lot of people, this might be success in school or dating and relationships or how you perform at work. And so when we hit those problems, we end up feeling bad, or we feel sad about it, or we feel stressed. And so when we face these negative emotional states, we have to do what's called cope, right? Which is to alleviate those negative affective feelings. And we typically try to approach solving those problems with 2 different types of coping. The first type of coping is called problem-focused coping. Problem-focused coping says, if the reason that this isn't working is that, let's say, for example, I didn't study for my tests, well then, because I feel bad that I did bad on this last test I took, I'm going to tackle that problem directly, and I'm going to study for the test this time. So we're taking this stressor, which is not having studied, it's doing poorly on a test, and we're directly attacking it. We're directly trying to solve it. The other type of coping we do is called emotion-focused coping. So when we're in a negative affective state, right? Let's say you just got your grade back on a test and you got like a 40 on it and you feel really bad about it. Your body is experiencing the emotional state of feeling negatively, and so instead of approaching the problem, which is that you didn't study, you work instead to cope with the feeling, right? So in that case, for some people it's eating. For some people it's video games. For some people it's distracting themselves. It's numbing it with drugs. It's there can be both really good adaptive ways to take care of yourself when you're feeling a negative feeling, but really destructive ways also exist that are not adaptive. And so instead of actually fixing the problem, you just focus on the feeling it has. Okay? It's avoiding or ignoring a stressor and attending to the emotional reaction you have. So it's important that you're able to balance both of these things in constructive ways, right? If you only do problem-focused coping and your nose is on the grindstone constantly, you're going to burn out. But if you only emotion-focused cope and instead of feeling, realizing that you're stressed out that you have a test coming up, so I'm going to just play video games to stop thinking about it, that's not constructive either. So find the way to balance those two things. So there's another important conditioning-based concept to learn called learned helplessness. So 2 rats receive simultaneous shocks. One can turn a wheel and stop the shocks. Another can't do that. The rat that cannot turn the wheel, we call the helpless rat, will become susceptible to ulcers and lowered immunity to diseases because they have developed what's called learned helplessness. It's realizing that there's no way I can fix this problem. I'm helpless in this situation, so I give up. And that giving up creates really strong stress responses. So this learned helplessness, it's hopelessness and passive resignation, meaning I give up. I'm just going to experience this because there's nothing I can do about it. It's very, very bad. It's not good when you get into a state of learned helplessness because it ends up creating insurmountable stress that leads to a lot of mental and physical health problems. And it's important when you're experiencing, if you think you're caught in a learned helplessness spiral, is to truly stop and think about what options you do have, because 99% of the time, there is something you can do in stressful situations. But if we get into a pattern of not being able to handle what's going on, we have those negative stress outcomes. Again, a perceived loss of control makes us vulnerable to stress and ill health. Nursing home residents found to feel less in control of decisions died earlier and declined faster. If you increase in those nursing home environments the level of self-control, or at least perception of choice, that stress and the health problems improve significantly. Okay? Losing control provokes an outpouring of stress hormones, and when that happens, your immune response drops and you get sicker faster. A big way of thinking about how we conceptualize control are through what we call locuses. So an internal locus of control or an external locus of control. Do you believe your life is beyond your control, and whose fault is your stress? These are kind of the questions you ask yourself when evaluating what your locus of control is. There's 2 types. The first is called the external locus of control. That is the perception that chance or outside forces determine fate. So for example, I only failed that test because the teacher didn't prepare us enough, right? So that's completely shirking off any personal responsibility. Fate made me do poorly on that test. The teacher made me do bad on the test. Everything is the fault of the external, right? We lost the game because the ref was totally unfair. It wasn't because the team did poorly, or the team could have practiced more. It's the ref's fault, right? So that is to externalize everything. The other difference, the other type is called an internal locus of control, which says, I control my fate. So people who believe their life has more internal control end up being more independent, happy, and felt less depressed than people who were mostly externally focused. Okay? More students now are typically externals, which may explain an increase in depression and other psychological disorders. So if we talk about psychological disorders, which we will later this semester, so much of disordered thinking and disordered behavior is cognitive. It's how we perceive and think about situations. And so when we're trying to evaluate why we might be feeling anxious or might be feeling depressed or hurt or upset, so much of it might come down to where you're putting the locus of control. Is the world out to get you, and nothing you do matters, and you're terrible at everything, so there's no point trying? Or do you actually have control that maybe you're not realizing? So those are the 2 locuses of control. Self-control is another interesting topic in psychology. It's kind of fun. In general, we talked about this earlier, humans can respond well to delayed reinforcers, right? So knowing that if I study throughout the course of the school year, I'll do well in the AP exam, that's a delayed reinforcer because the AP exam is months and months and months away. So doing the hard work now, so the question is, do you have the self-control to get you to that delayed reinforcer? So the ability to control your impulses and delay short-term gratification for long-term rewards is self-control. People who have better self-control are better adjusted, typically have better grades, and more social success. Students who planned their days and then lived it out as planned typically were at lower risk for depression. So the ability to exhibit that self-control is positively correlated with better psychological outcomes, although that level of self-control does require a good amount of energy and attention. Okay, so the last type of learning we're going to talk about is called observational learning, otherwise known as social learning. It is learning without direct experience. It's by observing others and modeling others. So for example, a child who sees his sister burn her fingers on a hot stove learns that he shouldn't touch it, right? Because he saw it happen from somebody else. You didn't have to experience it yourself. You learned by just observing. We learn our native languages and other various behaviors by observing and imitating in a process called modeling. Okay? So modeling is how we're able to learn observationally, by copying or internalizing what we see. So a really famous psychology experiment to know about is Albert Bandura's Bobo doll experiment. So here's the way this experiment plays out. A preschool child works on a drawing. So they're in a room, and there's a kid working on a drawing. And in another part of the room that they're in is this adult who is playing with Tinker Toys, just like little toys, trying to build things. Suddenly, the adult gets really agitated and frustrated. And so the adult gets up, and then for 10 minutes, pounds, kicks, and throws around this inflatable doll called the Bobo doll, yelling aggressive things while doing it. So this child witnesses an adult playing with toys, getting very frustrated, and then becoming very verbally and physically aggressive to this doll. The child, after he witnesses this, or he or she, or they, the child is taken to another room with appealing toys. So the child's taken to a room where they're seeing all these beautiful toys they want to play with. A researcher then takes away toys from that child and says, well, I'm going to take this to the other children. So the child experiences what in that moment? Probably frustration. So now comes the test. They're taken to a third room that has toys and a Bobo doll. So the question is, what does the child do? Well, children who observed the adults acting aggressively towards the Bobo doll modeled that and exhibited high levels of aggression towards the Bobo doll. I'm going to post this video underneath the lecture video so you can watch it. But it's a really, really famous study on modeling and the modeling of aggression. In general, right, children who observe aggressive behavior and who are constantly internalizing and modeling that aggressive behavior end up developing aggressive habits. So it's important that you are modeling positive things for children if you're rearing them. The process of modeling actually happens in the brain just from watching. Our brains tend to fire as if we're doing something, even if we just observe it. And that is the work of what are called mirror neurons. So in your frontal lobe, it's theorized that you have these neurons that fire watching someone do something as if you yourself are doing it. So it's doing that same processing from physically doing it and just watching it. And typically we accomplish that through imitation. Okay? All right. So more about modeling. Modeling that encourages constructive, positive behavior, otherwise known as pro-social behavior, is really beneficial and positive for child development, which makes a lot of sense, right? We can also see this modeled in adults, using behavior modeling to help new employees communicate, do better sales, and develop better business skills. Also, leaders of nonviolent protests help others to inspire and imitate their demeanor in their future discourses. There's also, very similarly, an antisocial effect when you see individuals around you influencing you and you're modeling aggressive behavior. So abusive parents tend to have aggressive children because they're witnessing the abuse. And they internalize that, and then they will model and they will mirror that in their own interactions. There's also a violence viewing effect when observing violent media, and that's viewing violent media can contribute to aggressive behavior, desensitization to violence, nightmares, and fears of being harmed. So otherwise known as violent video games. So herein spurs that debate of, does playing violent video games make a child more likely to be violent? Okay? All right, that is the end of this particular unit. I hope you learned a lot and followed the rest of your instructions for class today.